disaster didn't happen all at once. It began quietly with the first heavy rains of the 2024 rainy season in West and Central Africa. By March, rivers in Ghana and other countries in the region were already swelling, sending early warnings of flooding into communities downstream. Forecasters had predicted above average rainfall, but no one could foresee the unprecedented scale of what was to come. By June, early floods had displaced thousands, damaging homes and crops and claiming the first lives of the season. These initial signs were a harbinger of the catastrophe ahead, showing just how vulnerable the region had become to extreme weather. Then, in July and August, the rains intensified into relentless torrents. Countries like Chad, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo were hammered away as rivers overflowed, submerging towns and isolating communities. In Chad, the floods affected nearly 2 million people by late October, prompting the government to declare a state of national disaster. Across Nigeria, rivers broke their banks, turning entire towns into temporary lakes, forcing residents to flee their homes with little more than what they could carry. On September 10th, after continuous heavy rainfall, the dikes at the Alau Reservoir in northern Nigeria collapsed. This single failure sent a wall of water into Maiduguri, a city of over 1 million residents, displacing more than 200,000 people in a single day. The rains did not stop in September as expected. Instead, they persisted through October and into November, ensuring that floodwaters kept rising and communities remained submerged. By the end of October, more than 7 million people across 18 countries had been impacted, with the scale of destruction surpassing the previous year by 40%. The 2024 flood season had become the worst in decades for much of the region, a slow-motion disaster that refused to end. This creeping, relentless deluge marked the first stage of a crisis that would leave millions homeless, wipe out livelihoods, and test the resilience of governments and humanitarian organizations across the continent. The timeline of the floods shows not a single moment of disaster, but a series of escalating calamities, each compounding the next, and each revealing the fragile relationship between people, rivers, and the climate they depend upon. The scale of the 2024 floods was not simply a natural accident. It was the result of a dangerous combination of climate change and human vulnerability. Scientists from the World Weather Attribution Network determined that human-caused global warming made the season's extreme rainfall between 5 and 20% more intense across the Lake Chad basins. The warming atmosphere holds more moisture, releasing it in torrential downpours that overwhelmed rivers and drainage systems. Temperatures in the central Sahel region have been rising 50% faster than the global average, turning events that were once rare into recurring disasters. Human factors worsened the impact. Rapid and unplanned urban growth pushed millions of people into flood-prone areas, while aging infrastructure, from city drainage networks to dams, proved incapable of handling the volume of water. The Alau Reservoir dike collapse in northern Nigeria was tragic but predictable, a failure magnified by years of insufficient maintenance. In cities like Niamey and Lagos, poorly designed drainage and blocked waterways funneled floodwaters into residential neighborhoods, leaving thousands stranded and homes destroyed. Deforestation and land degradation also played a significant role. With fewer trees and vegetation to absorb rainfall, soil quickly turned into runoff, accelerating flooding in both urban and rural areas. Rivers that historically could contain seasonal rains became uncontrollable channels of destruction, sweeping away bridges, roads, and farmland. In essence, the floods were a perfect storm, natural rainfall amplified by climate change, funneled into regions unprepared for extreme weather. The combination of environmental degradation, rapid urbanization, and insufficient infrastructure created a disaster that was far larger than any single factor could have caused. The science behind the catastrophe shows that this was not just a seasonal event, but a stark warning of the increasing vulnerability of West and Central Africa to climate extremes. Beyond maps and data, the 2024 floods left a staggering human cost that will be remembered for decades. Across the affected region, the floods ultimately impacted 7.5 million people, uprooting lives and shattering communities. At least 1,527 people lost their lives, either drowned in fast-moving waters or trapped under collapsing homes, while an additional 4,499 suffered injuries. Entire families were forced to abandon their homes, with 1.7 million people becoming internal climate refugees, navigating flooded roads and unsafe shelters. The scale of displacement overwhelmed both formal and informal support systems. In Nigeria, Cameroon, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, entire neighborhoods were submerged, forcing residents to seek refuge in schools, mosques, and makeshift camps. The destruction of over 649,000 homes left countless people exposed to the elements, often with no access to clean water or electricity. Children were particularly vulnerable. In Sudan, they accounted for 15% of cholera cases and deaths as contaminated floodwaters spread disease. Beyond immediate survival, the floods disrupted education and healthcare. Schools and hospitals were damaged or destroyed, cutting off access to vital services just when communities needed them most. Contaminated water sources led to outbreaks of waterborne diseases, with cholera and diarrhea claiming additional lives. For families, the disaster was a double blow. First, the loss of shelter and possessions, and then the prolonged fight for health and stability. The human toll was compounded by the psychological strain. Survivors faced the trauma of losing loved ones, livelihoods, and entire neighborhoods. Children watched their schools and playgrounds washed away while adults struggled to provide basic necessities amidst chaos. These social and emotional scars, while less quantifiable than death counts or property damage, are just as enduring and define the long-term impact of the 2024 floods on West and Central Africa. The 2024 floods did not just wash away homes, they devastated entire economies and agricultural systems across West and Central Africa. An estimated 960,000 hectares of farmland were rendered unusable, an area larger than the country of Cyprus, just as crops were approaching harvest. This destruction threatened food security for millions, wiping out months of labor and leaving entire communities facing severe shortages. In Nigeria alone, over 315,000 acres of farmland were lost by mid-September, while in Chad, nearly 900,000 acres of fields were submerged under floodwaters. Livestock losses further compounded the economic impact. An estimated 128,000 cattle were swept away, removing a vital source of income, nutrition, and trade for countless families. These losses were not only immediate, but also long-term, as herds take years to rebuild. Infrastructure destruction magnified the crisis. Roads, bridges, and irrigation systems were obliterated, isolating rural communities and slowing the delivery of aid and recovery efforts. Over 1,277 schools and 221 health facilities were damaged or destroyed, depriving children of education and communities of medical care during the height of the crisis. Markets, storage facilities, and transportation networks were also disrupted, creating cascading effects on regional trade and economies. The financial toll of the 2024 floods is still being assessed, but preliminary estimates suggest losses in the billions of dollars, contributing to the already staggering $10 billion in annual climate-related losses across Africa. Beyond the immediate economic shock, the destruction undermined years of development progress, leaving communities even more vulnerable to future disasters. The floods were a stark reminder that the consequences of extreme weather extend far beyond water. They ripple through every facet of life, from food and income to education and health. The most alarming aspect of the 2024 West and Central Africa floods is that they are not likely to be isolated events. Scientists warn that as global temperatures continue to rise, extreme rainfall and flooding will become more frequent and more severe across the Sahel and Central Africa regions. These recurrent climate shocks leave communities with little time to recover, amplifying both economic losses and humanitarian vulnerability. Africa's disproportionate exposure to climate impacts is a stark injustice. The continent emits a fraction of global greenhouse gases, yet its populations suffer some of the most severe consequences. Countries already grappling with poverty, food insecurity, and conflict faced an even harsher reality as the floods magnified existing social and economic fragilities. Displacement, destruction, and disease created a cycle that left millions even more vulnerable to the next disaster. International aid, while critical, remains insufficient to fully address the scale of the crisis. Agencies such as the UN, IFRC, and UNICEF have mobilized relief operations, but logistical challenges and limited funding mean that recovery is slow and incomplete. Communities must not only rebuild homes, but also restore infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and agricultural systems to mitigate future risks. Experts emphasize that long-term adaptation is essential. Investment in resilient infrastructure, improved flood management systems, early warning networks, and sustainable development is critical to prevent similar devastation. The floods of 2024 exposed gaps in planning, governance, and disaster preparedness that must be addressed. Ultimately, the disaster serves as a warning to the global community. The 2024 floods were not just a natural catastrophe, they were a man-made disaster amplified by climate change and societal vulnerability. For the 7.5 million people affected, the memories of submerged homes, ruined livelihoods, and lost loved ones will linger for decades. The waters may have receded, but the lessons remain. Without urgent action on climate resilience and global cooperation, the next flood could be even more devastating. Laughter is usually a sign of happiness and joy, something light and uplifting. But imagine if laughter became something completely different, something that could disrupt entire communities, shut down schools, and leave doctors baffled. That's exactly what happened in 1962 in Tanganyika, which is now known as Tanzania. The country had just gained independence the previous year on December 9th, 1961, and was going through a time of big social changes. What began as a simple outbreak of laughter soon grew into a strange and disturbing epidemic that gripped villages and towns for months. This wasn't just laughter for fun, it was uncontrollable, exhausting, and deeply unsettling. Over the next few parts, we'll explore what really happened during this mysterious event, how it spread, and what it might teach us about the power of the human mind. The strange epidemic began in a small village called Kashasha, near Lake Victoria. On January 30th, 1962, just 3 schoolgirls at a mission-run boarding school started laughing, and they simply could not stop. Their laughter was uncontrollable and often mixed with crying and obvious distress, which made it clear this wasn't ordinary amusement. Within days, the laughter had spread to 95 of the 159 students at the school. Teachers watched helplessly as the students became unable to focus on their lessons. The situation escalated so rapidly that by March 18th, less than 2 months later, the school was forced to close and send the students home. Officials hoped this would end the outbreak, but instead it sparked something far bigger, allowing the laughter epidemic to spread beyond the school and into the wider community. Calling it a laughter epidemic doesn't capture how complex and troubling the situation really was. The uncontrollable laughter was just the most visible symptom, but it rarely brought joy. Many affected people experienced intense bouts of crying alongside the laughter, sometimes switching rapidly between the two. Physical symptoms were common, including severe headaches, fainting, and difficulty breathing during the laughing fits. Some even developed rashes. Beyond the physical, many reported feelings of deep fear and restlessness. Some ran aimlessly or became aggressive when restrained. Patients described sensations like being chased or having strange movements inside their heads. These episodes could last from a few hours to as long as 16 days and could return repeatedly after periods of normalcy. This was a frightening and exhausting experience that went far beyond what anyone expected from an outbreak of laughter. When the Kashasha school finally closed on March 18, 1962, the laughter didn't stop. It traveled with the students back to their home villages. Rather than ending the outbreak, sending the girls home caused it to ripple outward, sparking new cases in nearby communities. One of the earliest and largest secondary outbreaks happened in Shamba, a village about 55 miles from Bukoba, where many of the affected girls lived. Between April and May of that year, approximately 217 people out of a population around 10,000 experienced similar uncontrollable laughter and distress. These cases were mostly young adults and school children, including both boys and girls. The epidemic continued to spread in a pattern closely following the students' movements. When a student from the Iramashenye Girls Middle School near Bukoba returned home, another outbreak erupted there, affecting nearly a third of the students. Kanyangareka village also saw its own wave after a student carried the condition home. In total, the epidemic affected up to 1,000 people and forced 14 schools to shut down for periods ranging from 6 months to 18 months. Life in these areas was severely disrupted, with daily routines ground to a halt. Interestingly, the epidemic predominantly impacted young people, especially girls, while adults and teachers largely remained unaffected, deepening the mystery and anxiety surrounding the outbreak. As the laughter epidemic spread and schools remained closed, medical professionals scrambled to understand what was happening. Teams of doctors and researchers launched investigations, determined to find a physical cause behind the bizarre symptoms. They collected blood samples from affected individuals and those who had recovered, but tests revealed no viruses or infectious agents. Researchers explored environmental factors too, testing water and food supplies for toxins or contamination. One theory suggested poisoning from plants like datura seeds, but the symptoms and patterns didn't match up. Importantly, the illness didn't spread through contaminated food or water, but seemed to follow social interactions, which baffled investigators. Despite extensive testing and analysis, no clear physical cause was identified, leaving the medical community perplexed. The absence of any infectious or toxic agent intensified the confusion and fear among both villagers and officials, deepening the mystery of the laughter epidemic. With no physical cause found, experts turned their attention to psychological explanations. The leading theory became mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, where psychological distress manifests as real physical symptoms in groups of people. Importantly, those affected were not pretending. Their symptoms were genuine and could be severe. To understand why this happened in Tanganyika, it's key to look at the social context of the time. The country had just gained independence from British rule in December 1961, bringing major changes and uncertainty. Young people in mission schools faced increased pressure to succeed under stricter rules and new expectations. This mix of cultural tension, stress, and fear created a perfect psychological storm. The laughter epidemic can be seen as a collective response to this overwhelming anxiety, a way for the mind to express what words couldn't. The laughter epidemic didn't just stay in one place, it spread rapidly across villages and schools. This wasn't because of a virus or infection, but due to the way people influence each other's behavior, especially in tight communities. Seeing classmates or neighbors laughing uncontrollably could trigger the same reaction in others, especially when everyone was already stressed and anxious, and young people, particularly teenagers, are more susceptible to this kind of social influence because fitting in is so important to them. In this case, laughter acted like a chain reaction, passing from person to person, almost like an emotional epidemic. Adults with different social roles and coping mechanisms mostly remained unaffected. This pattern highlights how powerful our minds and social environments are in shaping physical experiences, especially in times of collective stress. Just as suddenly as it began, the laughter epidemic in Tanganyika gradually faded over the next 6 to 18 months. No specific medical treatment ended it. Instead, it slowly ran its course, leaving behind disrupted communities and schools. 14 schools had closed, some for over a year, deeply affecting the education of hundreds of students. While nobody died directly from the epidemic, many struggled with concentration and emotional distress long after the laughter stopped. Today, this event remains one of the most well-documented cases of mass psychogenic illness, showing how psychological stress can manifest as physical symptoms on a large scale. Despite the mass psychogenic illness explanation, many questions linger about why laughter, of all symptoms, dominated and how it moved through these communities so intensely. The 1962 laughter epidemic reminds us of the incredible and sometimes mysterious ways our minds, bodies, and societies are connected, especially during times of upheaval and uncertainty. In 2022, Somalia faced one of the worst droughts in 4 decades, a crisis that slowly crept across the country over the course of several years. By early that year, the nation was confronting its 5th consecutive failed rainy season, an unprecedented streak that left once fertile land parched and unyielding. For communities whose survival depended on the rhythm of seasonal rains, the sky's silence was catastrophic. Pastoralists watched as their herds, the lifeblood of their families, grew weaker with each passing day. Farmers stared at cracked, dusty fields where maize, sorghum, and other staple crops should have been thriving. By mid-2022, the human toll was already staggering. More than 7 million people were grappling with the effects of the drought, and over 755,000 had been forced to leave their homes. These numbers represented a massive wave of displacement, with families making the impossible choice to abandon generations of land and possessions in search of water, food, and safety. The crisis was visible not just in statistics, but in the dust-choked roads where people traveled on foot for days under a relentless sun. Water sources dried up first, leaving wells empty and rivers reduced to trickles. Livestock, which for many families represented both survival and wealth, succumbed to thirst and hunger at alarming rates. Pastoralists faced the gut-wrenching decision of watching their entire livelihoods evaporate. At the same time, crop failure swept across the agricultural regions, stripping families of income and food alike. This slow creeping disaster set the stage for a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented proportions. Every empty well, every dead animal, every withered field was a signal of the suffering to come. The drought was not a sudden event, but a prolonged assault, eroding both land and hope. By the end of part 1, it was clear that Somalia was facing a disaster that would touch every corner of the country and every aspect of daily life, leaving millions vulnerable and desperate. As the drought deepened, the land that once sustained Somali families became a barren expanse, forcing millions to make an agonizing choice: remain in their ancestral homes and face starvation, or embark on perilous journeys in search of survival. By the end of September 2022, over 1 million Somalis had been displaced due to the drought, with more than 1.1 million people seeking refuge in makeshift camps across the country. These internally displaced persons, IDPs, fled to urban centers like Baidoa, Dolo, Kismayo, and Beledweyne, hoping to find access to water, food, and humanitarian aid. Upon arrival, many IDPs found themselves in overcrowded camps with limited resources. In Baidoa alone, more than 200,000 people arrived between January and August 2022, adding to the city's existing population of approximately 600,000. This influx strained the already scarce resources, leading to dire conditions. The lack of clean water and inadequate sanitation in these camps created a breeding ground for diseases. Cholera outbreaks were reported in several drought-affected districts, including Baidoa, Danil, Johar, and Afgoy. Between January and July 2022, Somalia reported just under 8,000 cholera cases and 37 deaths, with over half of the cases occurring in children under 2 years of age. The humanitarian response, though commendable, was insufficient to meet the overwhelming needs. Only a third of IDP households received assistance by July 2022, and many of those who did received limited aid. The scarcity of food and clean water left families vulnerable, with women and children bearing the brunt of the crisis. The displacement crisis was not just a humanitarian emergency, it was a profound social upheaval. Communities were torn apart, and individuals who had once lived in relative stability found themselves in a constant struggle for survival. The loss of homes, livelihoods, and social networks left many feeling isolated and powerless. In the face of such adversity, the resilience of the Somali people shone through. Despite the hardships, many IDPs formed new communities within the camps, sharing resources and supporting one another. However, the scale of the crisis was such that even their collective strength was not enough to overcome the challenges they faced. The wave of displacement was a visible manifestation of the drought's devastating impact. It highlighted the urgent need for comprehensive humanitarian assistance and long-term solutions to address the underlying causes of displacement. As the world turned its attention to Somalia, the plight of the displaced served as a stark reminder of the human cost of climate-induced disasters. The 2022 drought in Somalia did more than displace millions. It tore apart the economic and environmental foundations that had sustained the country for generations. By mid-2022, over 3 million livestock had perished due to lack of water and pasture, devastating pastoralist families whose wealth, nutrition, and social standing depended on their herds. For many households, losing cattle, goats, and camels was equivalent to losing decades of accumulated wealth and security, leaving them in extreme poverty. The agricultural sector suffered similarly. Widespread crop failure struck staples such as sorghum, maize, and beans, leaving fields barren and food supplies critically low. This not only exacerbated hunger, but also eliminated a primary source of income for millions of rural households, forcing some to sell remaining livestock at a fraction of their value or abandon their farms entirely. Food prices skyrocketed in urban markets as demand outstripped supply, further straining families already grappling with economic hardship. The environmental consequences were equally severe. Rivers and seasonal water sources dried up, and soil degradation worsened, making future planting seasons increasingly uncertain. Pastoral lands that had supported nomadic communities for centuries were reduced to cracked earth, unable to recover without substantial rainfall. These combined losses triggered a vicious cycle. Displaced families migrated to camps or towns, adding pressure to already limited humanitarian resources and urban infrastructure. Infrastructure damage compounded the crisis. Wells, water points, and irrigation systems fell into disrepair under extreme conditions, further limiting access to water and sanitation. The scarcity of these basic resources contributed to outbreaks of waterborne diseases, including cholera, measles, and acute diarrhea, especially among children. In essence, the drought systematically dismantled Somalia's ability to sustain its population. The death of livestock, the collapse of agriculture, and the degradation of vital ecosystems created not just immediate suffering, but a long-term economic catastrophe. This structural failure was one of the most devastating elements of the drought, showing how a climate crisis can ripple through every aspect of society, leaving livelihoods, food systems, and environmental resilience in ruins. By understanding the scale of this economic and environmental collapse, it becomes clear that the 2022 drought was not just a natural disaster, it was a comprehensive societal disaster, touching every facet of life across the country and setting the stage for further suffering if long-term solutions were not implemented. While the images of displaced families and dying livestock dominated headlines, the deadliest impact of the 2022 Somalia drought was far less visible. It was a quiet, creeping tragedy, measured not in abandoned fields but in human lives lost in isolation. Between January 2022 and June 2024, estimates suggest that the drought caused approximately 71,100 excess deaths, a staggering figure that underscores the human cost beyond what humanitarian aid could immediately address. Children bore the brunt of this loss. Around 40% of those who died were under the age of 5, the most vulnerable to the combined effects of malnutrition, dehydration, and disease. The lack of access to adequate food weakened young bodies, leaving them highly susceptible to illnesses such as measles, cholera, and severe diarrhea. Even common childhood infections became fatal when compounded by prolonged malnutrition. The drought also indirectly contributed to rising mortality through the collapse of healthcare access. Rural clinics struggled to function with scarce water and dwindling supplies, while overcrowded camps amplified the spread of preventable diseases. For many families, traveling to a functioning health facility was impossible, leaving treatment out of reach and increasing fatality rates. Food insecurity amplified this silent toll. Millions faced severe hunger as crops failed and livestock died, and humanitarian aid could not fully meet the overwhelming demand. In many households, parents were forced to make impossible choices, rationing scarce resources among children and elders alike. In total, over 1 million children faced acute malnutrition by the end of 2022, highlighting that the drought was not only a crisis of water and crops, but also a catastrophic public health emergency. This silent toll, invisible from afar, but devastating in every affected community, represents one of the most harrowing dimensions of the drought. It shows that the most devastating consequences are often the ones hardest to see, quietly eroding life and potential long before they make headlines. It's tempting to view the 2022 Somalia drought as an isolated act of nature, a cruel stroke of luck, but the reality is far more complex. This drought was part of a larger pattern of climate instability affecting the Horn of Africa. Recurrent dry seasons, increasingly erratic rainfall, and prolonged heat waves are all linked to the intensifying effects of global warming. These climate shocks have become more frequent and more severe over the past 2 decades, leaving communities with little time to recover between disasters. The vulnerability of Somalia was compounded by long-term challenges. Decades of conflict, political instability, and widespread poverty had already weakened infrastructure and limited access to healthcare, water, and food systems. Communities that might have been able to weather a single dry season were left exposed to multiple shocks occurring in quick succession. In this sense, the drought was not just a natural event, it was a humanitarian and systemic crisis, magnified by years of instability. The humanitarian response, while vital, was largely reactive. Aid organizations worked tirelessly to deliver food, water, and medical supplies, but these interventions could only provide temporary relief. They did not address the underlying causes of fragile economy, over-reliance on rain-fed agriculture, and climate vulnerability. Without systemic changes, the cycle of drought, displacement, and malnutrition is likely to repeat. At its core, this drought was a stark warning. It illustrates how climate change disproportionately affects those who contribute least to the problem but bear the heaviest consequences. Somalia's crisis is a call to action for global climate adaptation. investment in resilient infrastructure, and policies aimed at mitigating future disasters. Understanding this unseen driver reshapes the question of devastation. The drought's most profound impact was not only the visible suffering, the displaced families, the dying livestock, the failed crops, but the structural vulnerability that turned a natural dry spell into a national catastrophe. It highlights that in modern disasters, the most devastating element often lies in the conditions that allow nature's fury to become human tragedy. Ultimately, the story of Somalia's 2022 drought is a warning to the world. It shows that without preparation, resilience, and global action, future climate events could produce even greater losses. The unseen driver reminds us that prevention, adaptation, and awareness are the true keys to mitigating the human cost of environmental disasters.